August 8th, 1999. This was a day that Park Ranger Lance Matson would never forget for the rest of his life. The heat was absolutely scorching in New Mexico's Carlsbad Caverns National Park, and in the early afternoon, Ranger Matson realized that a pair of hikers were long overdue. Now, it's not uncommon for hikers to get lost in national parks. Most of the time, they're found alive and well and go on to make a full recovery. But on rare occasions, well, they pass away during their ordeal, often due to heat exhaustion or dehydration. Ranger Matson probably assumed that one of those two scenarios would play out in front of him once he located these missing hikers. But much to his surprise, and also to his horror, the situation was much more complicated. So complicated, in fact, that he couldn't have even made it up if he had tried. Ranger Matson spotted a tent off in the distance, and he approached it, hoping that the two hikers were inside of it and alive. He was even met with some relief when Raffi Kodikian popped his head out of the tent and begged for water. But this relief was quickly crushed at the answer to one simple question that Ranger Matson asked him. Referring to Raffi's hiking partner and his best friend, David Coughlin, Ranger Matson asked, quote, "Where's your buddy?" Raffi answered, quote, "I killed him." The park ranger had stumbled upon a murder scene the likes of which nobody had ever seen before. And the reason I say that is not because of how violent Raffi's actions were or anything like that, but rather because of his motive. Was it possible that by killing his best friend, Raffi Kodikian was actually doing him a favor? Buckle up, folks, because you're about to hear one of the most confusing and honestly heart-wrenching stories in the history of backpacking. Folks, this is the murder of David Coughlin. So not only is this a morbidly fascinating story, it's also a unique one among the other outdoor murder stories that I've covered on this channel. And the reason for that is because there's a what would I do factor involved with this story, if that makes sense. The line between right and wrong, good and evil even, well, it's a little bit blurred. And so as I tell you this story, I want you to think objectively about what you would do if you were in this awful situation. Now, I personally do think there's a pretty obvious right and wrong way to handle things here, but I'm gonna do my best to save my opinions for later in the video and just tell you the facts. But with that said, as you hear this story unfold, I think that there's a pretty good chance you're going to be left with a lot of unanswered questions. I know that I certainly am, even after researching extensively for this video. I'll highlight the most obvious unanswered questions to me, and I also encourage you to leave your own unanswered questions in the comment section of this video. So without further ado, let's take a virtual trip to the desert of southern New Mexico. Now, I'm inviting you on this trip for free, but you must hit that subscribe button to cover your admission, especially if you're a repeat viewer of this channel. All right, let's go. Are you ready? 3, 2, 1. On August 4th, 1999, two best friends arrived at Carlsbad Caverns National Park. Their names were David Coughlin and Raffi Kodikian, and they were in the middle of this cross-country road trip that was supposed to take them from Boston, Massachusetts, all the way to Santa Barbara, California. Once they arrived there, Coughlin was supposed to start working towards his master's degree in environmental science at UC Santa Barbara. Kodikian, on the other hand, was simply just along for the ride, right? He was along for the adventure, and this was also not his first time on a cross-country road trip either. 2 years earlier, he had been working as a freelance writer, kind of part-time for the Boston Globe, and he actually published multiple articles detailing a 10-week road trip that he had taken through at least half of the states in the United States. Now, I'm not 100% sure why these two men in their 20s chose to stop at Carlsbad Caverns. I heard that maybe an uncle, a relative had recommended it to him. If you do a quick Google Maps search, it shows that the men's route from Boston to California, Southern California, well, it would have taken them through New Mexico, but still not terribly close to where this national park is located. But then again, I don't even know why I'm speculating about this. They were on a road trip after all. The journey was the purpose here. They weren't just focused on the end destination. And so ultimately, on August 4th, they spoke with a park ranger, they filled out their overnight camping permit, and then they drove their car to the trailhead for the now infamous Rattlesnake Canyon. Perhaps you've heard of it. So, as you can probably anticipate here, Rattlesnake Canyon is where this story starts to get incredibly disturbing. And so, before we get there, let's take a chill pill for just a moment here. Let's relax as I tell you about Helix Sleep. I told you we were gonna relax. That wasn't very relaxing. Let me get comfortable. Helix Sleep is the sponsor of this video. Now, I know that many of you have been struggling with your sleep lately. Possibly, but hopefully not due to some of the stories that I tell on this channel. So if you've been struggling with your sleep, have you considered getting yourself a new mattress? Helix Sleep makes premium mattresses and bedding that are customized to fit your needs and are conveniently shipped right to your front door. The shipping is totally free in the United States, and the mattresses come rolled up in this small box, and so it's super easy to set them up. So when I don't sleep well, especially for like multiple nights in a row, I just get grumpy and I'm just terrible to be around. But since I got my Helix mattress and I've been sleeping on it for about a month now, my friends and family are happy to report that I'm tolerable again. I've been falling asleep fast and sleeping so well every single night, and a huge reason for this is because I took the Helix Sleep Quiz before I ordered my mattress. The Helix Sleep Quiz matched me to a mattress that was designed to fit my unique body type and sleep preferences. And part of the reason I'm in this position right now is because, well, I'm a side sleeper, and I also tend to sleep kind of hot. And so based on my results, Helix matched me with their Midnight Luxe mattress. Oh, and by the way, I know that many of you are sharing a mattress with your partner, and so you can actually take the sleep quiz with your partner in order to find a mattress that is going to fit both of your sleep needs. Helix mattresses have a 10-year warranty, and they even have financing options and flexible payment plans. And are you ready for this? Helix is offering my audience, aka you, an exclusive discount this month. You are going to get 27% off your mattress purchase when you click the link in the description. This discount isn't gonna last very long, by the way, and so go do it right now. Click that link. And with that said, thank you, Helix, for sponsoring this video. I'm done relaxing. It's time to get back into the video. Now, folks, I've never hiked in Rattlesnake Canyon before, and honestly, after hearing this story, I'm not sure that I ever want to, but my understanding is that for the unprepared hiker, it can be an extremely dangerous place. It's dry, it's windy, I mean, it's the desert after all, it's exposed, and of course, in the summer, it can be extremely hot. Now, these are all dangers that can be pretty easily mitigated, and so I'm not suggesting that any hiker, whoever takes on Rattlesnake Canyon, is like walking right into a death trap. That would be dramatic and ridiculous. But for David Coughlin and Raffi Kodikian, that is exactly what they were doing when they parked their car and headed out into the canyon. Because they had been driving all day, the two men got a pretty late start on their hike. They would actually end up only hiking about 1.5 miles from their car before stopping to set up camp for the night. That next morning, their plan was to just simply backtrack to their vehicle, retrace their steps, and then, having gotten a small taste for Carlsbad Caverns National Park, continue their drive west towards California. But when the two men started hiking on the morning of August 5th, they quickly found themselves in a dire, to put it mildly, situation. They couldn't follow the trail that would lead them back to their car, lead them back to safety. They couldn't even find it, for that matter. And so they found themselves hopelessly lost in the remote desert with no compass and a dwindling water supply. The pair hiked all day, trying to find the trailhead, trying to find their car, but they just couldn't do it, folks. Their water supply was almost gone at this point, and they even resorted to eating cactus fruit to try to like get some sort of moisture in their mouths. This is just a desperate situation, and eventually they resigned to just spending another night in the canyon, clinging on to desperate hope that the next morning, August 6th, they would somehow find their way back. Folks, this did not happen. On August 6th, the nightmare that Coughlin and Kodikian were in only became infinitely worse. This was the day that they drank the last of their water supply, and they once again wandered around through the desert floor. They even climbed up to the rim of the canyon. You see, Kodikian had thought he saw a light, maybe like a headlamp or like car lights or something like that. He thought he saw that on the rim the previous night. And because of this, the two men hoped that, if they climbed up to this rim, if they exerted what was left of their dwindling strength, they got up there, that they would find, I don't know, some park rangers, or at the very least some other hikers, or maybe even the road that they drove in on. I wasn't there, obviously, but I can only imagine that this probably felt like their final chance at survival. But when Coughlin and Kodikian reached the top of the rim, they were greeted with nothing but miles of scorching desert beyond them. There were no rangers, there were no other hikers, and there were definitely no roads. And this is a very critical moment in this story, because we now know from reading the journals that the two men kept at the time that at this point, they pretty much knew that they were most likely going to die. And so they had no other option. They hiked back to their campsite, and this is brutal. By the time that they reached their campsite, they were just so dehydrated that they actually considered drinking their own urine. Now, from my research, I'm not sure if Coughlin was fully on board with this, but apparently Kodikian did try, and he failed, by the way. He wasn't able to even bring himself to swallow it. Now, I'm no expert on this, I promise you that, but the general scientific consensus seems to be that drinking your own urine will not actually hydrate you. It will actually have the opposite effect. And so, on the rare chance that any of you find yourself in a desperate situation like this, God forbid, don't drink your own urine. Trust me, just don't do it. When the two hikers had filled out their camping permits, they had actually been told by the people at the front desk to carry 1 gallon of water per person per day. But for whatever reason, the men pretty much straight up ignored this advice, and they only carried 3 quarts of water between the two of them. This was obviously a very bad decision that they would clearly come to regret. At this point, the men had fully come to the realization that if nobody found them, if nobody located them, they were completely and utterly screwed. Let's be honest. They would have no other choice but to suffer a drawn-out, slow death while just laying there in their tent, being able to do nothing besides jot down a few journal entries and suffer. And so at this point, the two men, they wrote down their wills. One entry from Coughlin's journal, which was actually addressed to his girlfriend, read, quote, "I am in utter agony, and I know you would understand. I've barely eaten and drank since Wednesday evening. Nobody is going to come." As nighttime was setting in the following day, both men started to become violently sick. Coughlin, in particular, was in bad shape. He was vomiting nonstop all night, probably due to how dehydrated and exhausted he was. When the sun finally rose on August 8th, it appears that Coughlin had basically had enough of the suffering and the pain. Well, at least according to Kodikian, that's what happened. Folks, the next series of events I'm about to describe to you are extremely disturbing, and they're basically what separate this story from other tales of survival and death in the wilderness that I've told you about. On the morning of August 8th, David Coughlin was in such agony that he apparently asked Raffi Kodikian, his best friend, to end his life for him. Kodikian wrote in his journal, quote, "David had been in pain all night long. At around 5 or 6, he turned to me and begged that I put my knife through his chest." And to this morbid request, Kodikian apparently obliged. He wrote, quote, "I did." And a second time when he wouldn't die. He still breathed and spoke, so I told him that I was going to cover his face. He said, okay. And then Kodikian wrote a chilling 4-word sentence. This is what he wrote. Quote, "He," referring to David, "struggled but died." Now, this next final sentence of Kodikian's journal entry seems to indicate that he knew at least somewhat of the moral implications of what he had just done to his best friend. He wrote, quote, "God, his family, mine, please forgive me." And so just like that, David Coughlin, well, he was dead. A few hours after the supposed mercy killing of Coughlin took place, Park Ranger Lance Matson was surveying the trailhead where the two men had parked their car. Ranger Matson realized that Coughlin and Kodikian's camping permit was supposed to have had them leaving the park like 3 days earlier, and thus something must have gone wrong. And so Matson set off down into Rattlesnake Canyon, which, launched the start of the search for the two lost hikers. And pretty quickly, actually, he spotted their tent, just a little bit off in the distance, which is a testament to how close the two lost hikers actually were to their car. As the ranger approached the tent, he would have had no idea that he was about to stumble right into a mystery that people would speculate over for literally years to come. So just before he reached the tent, Raffi Kodikian, clearly in bad shape, actually appeared out of it and said, quote, "Please tell me you have water." Ranger Matson, obviously prepared, did in fact have extra water, and he handed Kodikian a bottle. Kodikian then chugged this water like a frat boy chugging a beer at a party, apparently, and then, in similar fashion actually to how the frat boy situation might play out, he immediately vomited all over the desert floor. I guess this is kind of to be expected due to how dehydrated Kodikian was. The ranger actually advised him to kind of go easy on the water, so that he could hold it down. And then the ranger asked him, quote, "Where's your buddy?" In response to this, Kodikian directed Ranger Matson to a pile of rocks that was sitting just a few feet away from the tent. The ranger was confused initially, but Kodikian's next eerie sentence explained everything. Pointing to the rocks, Kodikian said, quote, "I killed him." David Coughlin's lifeless body was located underneath the rocks, which Kodikian had apparently covered him with. And so this all unfolds, and as Kodikian was being airlifted to the hospital, investigators began the very confusing task of piecing together what the hell had just happened. Now, listening to this story as I've told it so far, things might seem pretty straightforward, albeit a bit morally questionable, of course. But as investigators studied the scene and they put together the lost hikers' timeline, and they also poured through each of their journals, many questions started to emerge. Was this truly a mercy killing? And if it was, how on earth did it get to that point in the first place? Now, I won't speculate any longer about the questions that investigators may have had, and instead, I'm going to share with you the questions that I have. And I have a lot of them, by the way. So many, in fact, that I'm going to be spending a good amount of time in this video simply just pointing out how things in this story just don't seem to add up. And to be clear, I'm not saying that every single one of these unanswered questions can be attributed to malice. In fact, I'm sure that many of them were just due to negligence and bad decision making. But still, I'm just confused about what the hell happened during Coughlin and Kodikian's nightmare in Rattlesnake Canyon. So my first question is perhaps the easiest to answer, but it's so glaringly obvious that I just have to ask it. Why the hell did the men carry such little water with them when they went into the canyon? Again, when they filled out their camping permits, they were told point blank that they needed to carry far more than just 3 quarts of water. And yes, of course, they were only planning on camping for that one night, not the 3 nights that they actually ended up spending out there. But still, this just seems like such an obvious mistake that I had to mention it. Why did they carry such little water? And maybe I have an answer to this. I probably do. I think it can be pretty clearly attributed to just ignorance. I mean, they just made a bad choice, ignoring the Rangers' water recommendations. And my next question can probably be answered by the very same reasoning, for that matter. How the hell did the men spend 2 days wandering around the desert and not find the trail to their car or even the car itself? According to one source I found, Coughlin and Kodikian's campsite was on a side trail that was marked with rock cairns, which led some 250 feet back to the main trail. And then this main trail was only about a mile to a mile and a half away from their parked car. Don't get me wrong, I can understand it being a little confusing. I mean, maybe they couldn't find the trail immediately, or maybe it just wasn't that obvious or something like that. But with the amount of time that they spent searching for a way back to their car, it just doesn't make sense to me how they didn't find it eventually. It wasn't like they were miles and miles away from any established trail. I mean, they were so close to the trail and to their car. But then again, I don't think either one of these men were super experienced hikers. And so that, coupled with the confusion and the panic that dehydration brings, provides a at least somewhat plausible explanation for why they couldn't find their way back, I guess. And so we'll move on. My next unanswered question is one that I don't see many other people asking about this story, actually. And I will admit there's probably a good explanation for this, and I just don't know it due to lack of information. But I still have to ask, how come it took so long for the Rangers to realize that the men were missing? And let me be clear here, I'm not blaming the Rangers for this situation. I'm a firm believer that when you go into the backcountry, you and only you are responsible for your safety. It's not anyone else's responsibility, but it just seems strange that the Rangers knew the 2 men were only supposed to be camping for 1 night, and yet it took 3 more days essentially before anyone realized that they were missing, that they were overdue. Again, I could be not getting something here, and so if you have an explanation for this, please leave it in the comments. But I don't know, I couldn't quite shake this question when I was researching for this story. All right, so now let's get into some of the more disturbing, you could say, unanswered questions. And I know I use that word a lot in my videos. I've already used it probably 7 times in this one, but I don't know, I just can't think of a more fitting description for what I'm about to tell you. And I think you're going to understand why I say that as I give you some of the details about what investigators uncovered after Kodikian was rescued. When Raffi Kodikian was brought to the hospital, it was clear that he was severely dehydrated. However, as was noted by Ranger Matson, he was all there, if you know what I mean. He could speak fine, he was cognizant of what was going on around him, and he was even apparently able to walk unassisted. And what's even more damning is that after being treated for only about an hour at the hospital, Kodikian was apparently in good enough health to be discharged and brought to jail. I'm telling you, they put an IV in him, and he sat there for about an hour, and that's all it took for him to bounce back well enough to leave the hospital. I find this a bit strange. I mean, you'd think that after such a severe survival situation, one so severe that it was necessary to put Coughlin out of his misery and kill him, I don't know, you'd think that Kodikian would have spent days in the hospital recovering, not just hours, let alone 1 single hour. I'm no doctor, obviously, but I don't know. Doesn't that just seem a bit strange to you? And then what's even stranger are the results from David Coughlin's autopsy. It showed that Coughlin was in fact severely dehydrated, but that he was not mere inches away from death or anything like that. All evidence suggests that if he had not been stabbed by Kodikian, he would have survived, especially with the hindsight of knowing that rescue was only a few hours away at the time. And so my question is, why did Kodikian kill David Coughlin if they both still had life left in them. Okay, so that's the question. Now I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit here. And so, of course, it's worth mentioning that Coughlin and Kodikian, well, they were suffering, and thus they probably didn't realize that their bodies would hold out longer. And in addition to that, they definitely weren't thinking clearly. So I can understand them thinking that they were closer to death than they actually were, but I can't understand why Kodikian would kill his best friend at his command so quickly. The next unanswered question I have, and this one might be the most confusing of all of them, is how Kodikian was able to cover Coughlin's body with rocks. You'll recall that when Ranger Mattson first stumbled into the campsite, Kodikian directed him to like this pile of rocks that he had used in a makeshift burial for Coughlin. And honestly, maybe using the word rocks here is a bit of an understatement, because from the sources that I found, these weren't just like small little rocks. They were more like full-on boulders. I'm talking boulders between like 60 to 80 pounds each, not just little pebbles, okay? If Kodikian was so weak and desperate from dehydration, how the hell was he able to move multiple heavy boulders to cover up Coughlin's body? And it gets even worse still. Now, I would take this next little bit of information with a grain of salt because I only found one legitimate source that stated this, but according to that source, apparently Kodikian's lawyer said that after he killed Coughlin, he also intended to kill himself, but he wasn't able to do that because he was apparently too weak. He didn't have the strength. But if he didn't have the strength to end his own life, how did he have the strength to move all of those boulders? It just doesn't make sense to me. Now, the biggest unanswered question I have, I kind of touched on this already, and this is also where I'm just going to openly share my opinion, although you can probably tell what it is already. This question is, why the hell would you ever kill your best friend, or anyone for that matter, even if they asked for it? Now, I've never been, and hopefully never will be, in a situation as dire as the one Kodikian and Coughlin found themselves in. And I don't know, maybe this is one of those situations where you shouldn't judge until you've been in their shoes. So if that's how you feel, then fair enough. But I don't know. I just can't ever imagine killing my best friend, even if they were begging for it. I'd like to think that I would never, ever give up in a situation like this and never resort to just ending it like that. I don't know, dude. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Ultimately, Raffi Kodikian pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with all but 2 of them suspended. I think I've been pretty harsh on Kodikian in this video, but I do think it's important to note that David Coughlin's family, well, they showed no ill will towards him for taking Coughlin's life. In a letter they sent to the prosecutor of Kodikian's case, Coughlin's family said, quote, "We can think of no reason why Raffi would have wished David any harm or pain. Moreover, we cannot presume to know what transpired or the thoughts and emotions that the two experienced during the days before David's death. To be sure, we have questions. However, we find it difficult to believe there was any malicious intent." During his sentencing, Kodikian upheld that he believed he was doing the right thing by killing Coughlin, but also added that he regrets the way that things transpired. He said, quote, "This is something I'm going to live with for the rest of my life. This isn't a 2-year sentence for me. This is a life sentence. If one of us came out of that canyon, both of us should have. It's not fair that only one of us made it out." So, what do you guys think of this story? And also, perhaps more interestingly, what would you have done if you were in Raffi Kodikian's shoes? I want to hear your respectful thoughts, of course. And with that said, I'll see all of you next week.